Hello and welcome back to my next podcast session. Today, I've got the pleasure to talk with Andreas from SUSE. We know each other since a couple of years and very nice to have you here. And maybe you can introduce yourself a little bit, what you're doing at SUSE.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to do that, and also happy to be here and dive much deeper into a very exciting topic, which will be sovereignty. And I'm the global head of sovereign solutions here at SUSE. And my role actually is to bring all the initiatives that SUSE has from their product portfolio, their partner ecosystem, together into a market motion, go-to market where our customers, primarily Europe, Middle East, and Africa, have a lot of sovereignty questions and actually need products and services that help them. And I oversee that initiative in the broader SUSE. So a very small team from a personnel perspective, but a very broad reach and lots of collaboration with lots of colleagues in many different functions.
Nice. And before we jump into the topic, we were joking a little bit in the beginning that it's quite hard for me to pronounce it the right way. And maybe you can explain how it's been pronounced correctly. So you told me sovereign is okay, sovereignty is okay, but maybe for the audience you can explain like what is behind a potential buzzword and what is like the real meaning and how to pronounce it right.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. So what I understood from a colleague who's been in the press and in the media before, 70% of the world would say sovereignty, so sovereign or sovereignty, and about 30% would say sovereignty, right? So primarily in the Netherlands, but also in Germany, but also a little bit in England, I've noticed that people pronounce it that way. But that's just right how it sounds. What is much more important, I do think, is to truly understand what it actually is. And what we see happening at our customers, right, primarily due to the geographical tensions, right, between the continents, with presidents and countries being at war or economically dependent on each other, all of a sudden people start to realize that their companies are heavily reliant on IT, right? And if this software is under a particular act, like the Cloud Act, but also China and other regions have particular acts, and they might stop their software, then all of a sudden their business is at risk. So in Europe, the buzzword I would argue is sovereignty, but it ultimately boils down to business resilience, right? How resilient is your business in foreign dependencies to your business? And since every company has become a software company, right, all of a sudden there's a big risk. And just to finish up, funny enough, if you take a look at other regions, they would use a different term that comes down to the same meaning. So in the US, with a lot of our American customers, we speak very often about data security, which is ultimately boiling down to the same risk assessment. Who owns the data owns the company, you could argue. It's in some regions about autonomy, right? So you see all different words that boil down to, am I ultimately, as a company owner, able to operate my company without foreign influences and legislation driving these changes? And I do think with software, right, that's a very interesting way of looking at it, and it's a very broad spectrum of what companies needs to do there.
And would you say it's only for like small businesses, or is it something that only enterprises should take care of?
I do think it's every company that should absolutely consider how they are dependent on software. But if you think about the bigger companies, right, let's say the banking, the healthcare, but also the manufacturing, right, which are all big software plants, right, producing physical goods or services, they should definitely consider it and make a conscious decision. Think about an electricity grid provider, right, that is critical infrastructure, or the harbors, or the airports, or the trains, right? They are critical infrastructure to a country. So when that stops, right, the entire economy or the country, or even worse, would stop, right? So for big companies with critical infrastructure, it's absolutely a topic to consider. As a small company, well, your business might be equally dependent on software, right? So you also need to make choices, seek for alternatives, but you might make different decisions there, right? Because it's a lower risk to your company, or it's less mission critical. So there's a kind of a regional or a country dependency to mission critical infrastructure, hospitals, etc. And then there's obviously the company that needs to make a decision themselves on, hey, how reliant do I want to be on other
Mhm.
companies or rules? But honestly speaking, for a small company, right, that doesn't want to spend lots of man hours on IT, right, their choices might be different, right? And they might most likely quicker pick a SaaS solution, right, to solve the problem of
Yeah.
some bookkeeping or whatever, rather than a larger enterprise that has more room to make choices.
Yeah. And isn't it like the combination of where your market is, like really where you are selling your end product, and like what type of infrastructure you need? So, I mean, if you are just selling, for example, in the Netherlands or just in Europe, do you really need like a multi-region cloud provider application? It's really like this combination, or is it something else?
Yeah, I do think there are many angles to the decision framework that you can make, right? So one is I would always suggest, and in conversations, is make a ranking of your applications from a criticality perspective,
Hmm.
right? So if you're an electricity grid provider and it's about the software, right, that operates the grid, right, that's absolutely a crown jewel. Versus if you have just regular business operations, right, that run only once a week or once a month somewhere down in the team, right, very operational. You see already, right, that in that same company you can make different decisions to say,
Yes.
hey, the crown jewels, they need to run entirely independent, right, in my own control, versus the regular business applications, I can perfectly run that on an
Hmm.
hyperscaler. And we see that move, right, people becoming aware and then making different choices in the same company on where would they locate. Another interesting element, right, is if you are anyhow a company that operates across, let's say, hey, Europe and the US, which many of our companies are, right? And you have entities in both, well, the risk, right, of not being able to use Office 365 or G Suite is significantly lower because you also have a legal entity on the other side of the ocean, right? So that's also a way of looking at it.
Oh
And
yeah.
yeah, and also probably interesting, right, is how quickly can you pivot
Yeah.
your architecture. And what we see happening now is at hyperscalers is people would normally use a Kubernetes from AWS, GCP, or Azure, and they're
Hmm.
now decoupling. So they now say, hey, I only use compute. I still stick to the hyperscaler, but I run, for example, run your Kubernetes engine, the version from SUSE or K3S or others. I run that on top. So that means that when I'm no longer allowed to use the hyperscaler, my workload is pretty portable
Yes.
and I can bring that over to another cloud. So lots of movements to reduce the risk and yeah, making decisions from an architectural perspective.
Hmm. That's a good point, and especially like our customer base, we can see like there are always some hiccups in the main cloud providers, and after such a hiccup or an outage, they are yeah reconsidering their final decision. Was it a good one at that point in time, or should we now move to another cloud provider? Nowadays, they also realize, hey, we need to run on a multi-cloud strategy, which is exactly getting in that direction you mentioned.
Yeah.
Um, what I want to talk about now is in my previous episodes, always there was like the term coming up socio-technical system. And it's just to recap it, the socio-technical system is really like the combination of the infrastructure, the processes, the applications, but also like the people, the teams, the organization itself you need to really provide your end service, your product for your customer. And now the question is, how to make sure that your organization is able to move as fast as needed if you are running on a multi-cloud strategy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very tough question, right?
I
Because
know.
it sounds easy on paper to move from
Yeah.
one to the other, right? But we all know that there are so many dependencies. And I do think, in particular, the hyperscalers did an amazing job, right? Not to just provide the infrastructure, but to provide all the out of the box services, right? So our application architectures are heavily reliant on very specific services offered by one of the three hyperscalers. And moving away there means simply, right, refactoring sometimes your entire application
Yeah.
because you need to go from an AWS specific database to a universal database or message queue or anything like that, right? So um, easier said than done, right? But from a reliability perspective, that's a huge migration because you know for sure how stable and how it
Mm.
performs, right? When you make use of such an out of the box service. And now you move to an infrastructure provider or a local hosting provider that only provides infrastructure, and you need to build a reliable solution yourself, right? So that's not an easy pivot. So if you really need to move, I do think you really need to start re-architecturing, and we see that happening already with new developments, as the
Mm-hmm.
people are taking sovereignty, like security and performance, right, and reliability into their decision-making framework of how do you design a stack. That's one.
Mm-hmm.
Second, interestingly enough, what we see is slowly, I would argue, the awareness of where are your people, right? Where's the personnel located?
Yeah.
In particular, if you make use of third-party services and you say, hey, I want to become more sovereign, do you make use of support engineers, for example, that are in your same jurisdictional region, right? Because yeah, if something might happen, then the move is harder. We see the move, right, going to more local hosting providers. And if you take a look at the Europe, right, the Hetzner's, the Ionos, the Nextclouds, the OVH Cloud, right, they're absolutely growing. Recently, I saw some stats, right? It's significant,
Mm-hmm.
but it's still a small portion, obviously, relatively to what the others have to provide. And the migration, to me, right, the reliability of your business process, right, running on the new stack, that's absolutely something. Yeah, that's putting pressure on the shoulders of engineering teams and engineering leaders.
Maybe we can get in a little bit more like the infrastructure level and what's like Zeus's perspective on it.
Yeah, so many times, right, when you start a conversation, the conversation very often happens about the applications where your user interacts with.
Yes.
Obviously, I would argue, right, because that's most common. But what about the underlying stack, right? What about the middleware? What about the Linux, right? The OS that is running on the cloud? Or what about the physical data center, right? Who's owning it? Where is it hosted? And some companies would go as far as, but what about the chips, right, that you run there and the software
Mm-hmm.
in the kernel, right? So there's a lot underneath that the tiny business application that is important. Our take, right, is absolutely make it open source, right, as much as the stack as possible, right, because open source, right,
Yeah.
gives the promise and the ability whenever, right, let's say SUSE would be shut down, right, which won't happen, but imagine, right, or another company, if the software is open source, you can pick it up yourself, ask another consultant to help out, and continue your business operations.
Mm-hmm.
So that is in my mind and in our mind one of the most important drivers to become more sovereign. But then when you think about sovereignty and open source, that's not enough, I would argue, because what we see happening is that regions ask that the software is built in their particular region, right? So you not only need to think about, hey, I have an open source Linux, SUSE Linux, for example, but can I have my own version? So we are thinking about, and we've launched the concept of reproducible build. So
Yeah.
no matter where you build across the world, at what given time, the outcome is always the same.
Is it really like the region you are building the software is important and not like the outcome of this build,
Yeah,
wherever it was
because
done?
so that is happening at the moment, right? It's not widespread yet, but governments, defense, right? They start to ask these questions, right? Can I build it here?
Ah,
I do think what we'll see towards the future is also third party verifiers, right? To say, hey, what is built is indeed what we expected to be built.
mm-hmm.
The other, I do think, very important element, what we see in our stack and in conversation with the customers, is can you actually prove that what I download is indeed what I think I download, right? So where is it built? Who built it? How is it built? What is in there? What are all the libraries? What are the vulnerabilities? What are
Yeah.
all the license type? And we see the term software bill of materials at the station. So prove, right, that you can have a particular systematic approach of building software. And we think that that becomes more and more important. So rather than pulling randomly from the internet an
Mm-hmm.
artifact, right, pull them from a trustworthy source into your organization. So you at least know, right, what you're pulling into the organization.
Yeah.
And then with all the S code capabilities, policy S code, you can simply say, hey, only these type of packages, they come into my CI/CD pipelines, into production, etc.
Mhm. And is this even more important with like, yeah, AI code generation? Like if you use Claude Code and is just pulling dependencies like hell?
Yeah, I think AI is just making the mix even worse. I don't know why, but this morning I was reading an article on LinkedIn, right? Is most of these AI models are trained on stuff a little while ago. right?
Yes.
So 2 years ago. So imagine there's a vulnerability that's already fixed and patched and whatever, but the model itself was trained on it, right? Does it then inject? I do think primarily the spaghetti, right, that is generated. So if you like vibe coding, like I do, because I cannot program a single line of code, before you go to production, right, there always needs to be someone else, right, to clean it, to structure it, and to verify it. So I definitely think that the usage of AI tools is bringing yet another complexity because portions of what is generated, if you do it to people like me, you're unknown to it. The other very interesting angle when it comes down to sovereignty, and not a lot of people understand and realize, but we use Slack, we use G Suite, we use Salesforce, right? And all these tools have their lovely AI assistants, but we're leaking, if you like, a lot of data and knowledge from our company to these models, right? And I do think from a sovereignty perspective, the world is only partially aware
Yeah.
the potential risk there. I'm not pointing fingers here, right? But are you aware that this is running, right? And that lots of data is used to train and whatever. Yeah,
Mhm.
I think that's another way of looking at sovereignty as such. And if you think about how we do that at SUSE, we also have assisted troubleshooting, right? So we have introduced Liz from our Lizard, and an AI assistant in Rancher Manager, and you can run it on ChatGPT, you can run it on Gemini, but very important, you can also run it on your local models, right?
Mhm.
Because if you don't want to have information leaked from your production environments, well, that's the level, right, that you need to think about it from a resilience perspective.
Mhm. Well explained, really. This answered a lot of my questions. So, is there a link between sovereignty and the reliability of your system? So, is there really like what is sovereignty providing me to be more reliable in my system?
Yeah. So one aspect there I touched upon already is imagine you need to migrate from one to another. Well, then there's big time reliability
Mhm.
and resilience involved, right? Can you guarantee what was running stable, smooth, performant on the hyperscaler runs equal in your other data center, right? And then I do think chaos engineering and all these type of testing are absolutely valuable to get a good comparison and to model and to detail that out. That's one aspect. I think the other aspect that's very interesting from a reliability perspective is if you imagine that um, you would run a test where one component is taking out of your entire chain, right?
Mhm.
Won't happen right overnight, but how stable is your entire business stack from an application perspective? And I haven't seen it yet that companies start to run these simulations, but I do think it would be interesting from a resilience perspective to make almost a business mapping, right? If this component would fail or
Yes.
would be taken out, how can I then still operate my business as a whole? And then the third angle that I see happening is I spoke about decoupling from a AWS, GCP, or Azure dedicated Kubernetes engine, right? Let's keep it simple and small. What if you start to decouple, right? You still are at the hyperscaler, but you start to use, for example, run your Kubernetes engine,
Mhm.
right, or K3S. Well, do you then still have the same performance and the same reliability and stability as you would have using a dedicated hyperscaler version? So I see a lot of elements in the migration itself in becoming more resilient, more sovereign. Yeah, where reliability is absolutely an aspect to take into account, like any big migration, I would argue.
So you touched on the your topic of course, chaos engineering, which I love a lot. And if I'm getting it right, you would use chaos engineering or like the method of running experiments more like as a quality inspector, quality gate to see like, okay, if I'm now running on one dedicated cloud provider and now I would like to run on a multi-cloud strategy, I can run and create experiments that are verifying in the new system that everything is working as before.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
What do you think? How prepared are companies to really know their risk in the system? Are they just taking it because they don't know or zero? Okay.
I personally, I do think we are really at the beginning of the entire transformation and journey, right? So if I take a look at the conversations we are having with our customers, they are very early stage. So decisions are made, migrations are started, but we're not yet at the stage, right, that entire stacks or multi-cloud strategies are implemented. So I do think it starts at the boardroom level, also primarily driven by new and upcoming legislation in Europe, the Cyber Resilience Act,
Yeah.
the awareness around the US Cloud Act, right? So boardroom level attention, making decisions. I would argue many easy decisions are made first. I can come back to that in a minute. And then the bigger, more architectural changes need to be made. And what for example, what I see happening at SUSE is you could argue we have kind of three larger, well, we have more, but for simplicity, we have three larger product families. We have one around Linux. We have a very nice offering where we can manage your Red Hat Linux, right, for less cost. So you stick to Red Hat Linux, but we take over as SUSE from a support perspective. We take over supporting that particular capability. Well, that's almost risk-free from an operational stability perspective for larger enterprises because you don't need to migrate yet to a SUSE Linux. If you would, right, it's really easy. But we simply take over support. So operational risk close to zero, but reducing the risk of being dependent on foreign entities, absolutely spot on. And the next move that we see happening, right, is with the entire VMware, right? So companies want to move away from VMware for sovereignty reasons and for cost reasons. Well, we have an alternative, SUSE virtualization. But that transformation is already a real transformation because you need to build other VMs, operate them at a slightly different platform, right? So that is a migration, and it already brings more risk and stability uncertainties to the business, but it's still doable because a VM, you could argue, is a VM, not entirely, but right. The third element is now imagine you want to become more autonomous and you want to build your cloud native stack entirely in your own data center rather than being dependent on a hyperscaler. Well, all of a sudden, you're deeply tied into that hyperscaler ecosystem, and now you need to build your entire cloud platform yourself with Rancher, with probably a layer of virtualization, with components on top. Well, you see, right, how that gets more and more difficult, and also how you're introducing more stability, risk,
and complexity.
And complexity, yeah, obviously. So the move is there, but speaking about the last step, really transforming your landscape, well, that's a humongous engineering effort, right? And that's where I do think the chaos engineering and the reliability testing, etc., is much more important than just moving over Red Hat Linux right into a SUSE supported version as such.
Do you really see like this is getting a priority and it's been pushed hard to get to that point? Or what I sometimes identify is like, oh, okay, it's more like a check. We've done it. That's a badge. Yeah, move on.
I would argue, well, this is probably the biggest wave and transformation I've seen, right? And I do think about 10, 15 years ago with the whole agile, DevOps, CI/CD transformation, that really transformed because people all of a sudden were collaborating, right? And we had pipelines from coding to production, pushing it to 40 minutes rather than 40 days. So I would say in my career, that was a very big movement. This one is even bigger. I absolutely see it. So we started, is sovereignty a buzzword? I would argue absolutely yes. But does it drive a lot of change and transformation in many IT teams and organizations? Absolutely, right? The number of times I'm involved in a call where the CTO or the CIO is at the table, that's happening more than once a week at the moment, right? So the move is on, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And who really owns that topic? Is it really like top-down owned, or is it like also that the team wants to push for this way of doing?
It depends a little bit. Many organizations, there's absolutely a top-down approach because there's a top liability in the Cyber Resilience Act, in DORA, right? The executives being personally liable for whatever is happening. So all of a sudden, it's a topic. It's a boardroom topic because all of a sudden, people become aware that they run on software, right? And that's not as reliable from a legislation perspective as ever dreamed about. No one could imagine, right, that these tensions are happening across the world. And then AI has added a level of complexity. So it's definitely boardroom awareness, driving changes deeper down in the organization. Funny enough, in some situations, Rancher, for example, was already used. I've heard numerous examples, but not picked as the platform standard.
Yeah.
So people liked it, very community oriented, grassroots adoption. And now all of a sudden, right, it becomes the standard in the organization. So that happens as well, but very often, right, it's the other way around, driven from a risk, assessing what needs to change, what are my crown jewels, and where can we start changing the architecture and the choices.
Mm-hmm. And to double down on this and also getting into the like takeaways section of this episode is, so from the leaders, what takeaways you can mention and what should teams take in mind, or how they should prepare themselves, but also maybe push for the topic?
Yeah. Yeah. So for the leaders, what I do think what we really need to do as an industry is bring a little bit of structure in our thinking, right? So we speak a lot about sovereignty. And if you follow the Gardeners and the Foresters, they say it as technological, data, and operational sovereignty. But it doesn't tell you a lot. What the EU has done, October last year, they've launched the Cloud Sovereignty Framework. And in my mind, companies should really thoroughly assess their company as a whole on these 8 objectives that are written down in this cloud sovereignty framework, because that gives a very good structure in understanding how sovereign am I according to these major 8 categories, and then they have scoring levels and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So for leaders, I would say absolutely do this. Then one level below, what I would recommend is start to investigate what is kind of the ranking of your risk levels from an application. So what ones are crown jewels, mission critical, business critical, and regular applications, because that would determine if you need to change, right? And if you want to invest in becoming more sovereign, is what are the applications that you should focus on first. And then if you go to architects, or the combination of these senior leader and architects, is what are the quick wins, right? Can you bring over contracts from one to the other? Are there good European alternatives, say if you're in Europe, or South Africa or Middle East alternatives that you can pick from? And I would suggest make a very nuanced approach, right? It's not that you as a company need to leave all your applications or move them all away from the hyperscaler, but probably a few, right? So make different judgments. And then from the engineering teams, I would argue that really depends on what you've done in that middle layer, right? How did you assess the criticality of your applications, the risk involved, and then start changing, right? Like we do change already for ages in IT, and think about future projects and decisions. Can you make them more autonomous in your architecture, less dependent on other technologies? And then open source, right, is in my mind absolutely a fundament to pick from for these teams in moving forward and building new applications.
One last question, how to say it? Translation is needed in between, like the engineering teams that want to do something regarding sovereignty, and like when the leaders are jumping in. Is there like a clash?
No, I haven't seen a clash, right? The only clash that I see is that if a leader might pick a technology that's disliked by the engineering teams,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
There might be a clash in that sense, and that happens sometimes. Once assessed the right way, where is your risk? What applications? Right? If you combine that, then it's almost obvious the technology you need to choose to lower the risk for your particular application. So I don't, from that aspect, I haven't seen any clashes as such going on. No, not yet.
Okay, sounds very good. So before we are closing this session, what is the best way if people want to interact with you, would like to reach out to you?
I would recommend follow me on LinkedIn. I'm very active there, sharing lots of, I do think, interesting sovereignty information. So if you want to stay up to date, what's happening, absolutely follow me, and happy to continue the conversation there.
Nice. And then thank you very much. I learned a lot about this topic. I will try to improve how to pronounce it correctly. And thank you very much for being a guest on my podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much.